By the 12th century before Christ, Troy had already become one of the most important cities in the Bronze Age world. A fortified citadel raised on a steep hill in northwestern Anatolia, surrounded by limestone walls that rose more than 30 feet high, with rectangular towers from which the entire Trojan plain could be seen and, in the distance, the waters of the Dardanelles Strait. Below the citadel, a lower town spread across a vast area protected by a ditch carved into the bedrock. There lived merchants, craftsmen, shepherds and weavers, connected by trade routes that stretched from the Aegean to Mesopotamia, from the Balkans to the shores of the Black Sea. The city was not the largest in the ancient world, but its position made it impossible to ignore. In this video, I use modern AI tools to bring historic paintings, maps and engravings to life, shifting perspective, changing camera angles, and moving through these scenes in ways their original artists never could. The goal isn't just to look at the past, but to step into it, to walk through Troy as it once was, and imagine what it might have felt like to stand there on the last night before everything changed forever. And if you stick around until the end, we'll compare these same locations to how they look today, to see what time has changed and what still remains. Before we set foot in ancient Troy, it helps to understand how this city came to exist and why it occupied the place it did. The site where it stood, known today as Hisarlik, sits in northwestern Turkey, a few miles from the Aegean coast and a short distance from the southern entrance to the Dardanelles. It's what archaeologists call a tell, an artificial mound that formed over millennia from the accumulated remains of each phase of occupation. Layer upon layer, civilization upon civilization, each one built literally on the ruins of the one before it, until the mound rose more than 50 feet above the surrounding landscape. In all, 9 major layers have been identified, from Troy I, the oldest, dating to around 3,000 years before Christ, to Troy IX, from the Roman period. The Troy that concerns us here is the one archaeologists call Troy 7A, the final phase of the late Bronze Age city. It was built shortly after the destruction of an earlier phase, apparently by the same people. The builders reused many of the surviving structures, especially the great citadel walls, which they repaired with new stone towers and mud brick breastworks. This was a city that had been rebuilt before and carried on its body the marks of everything it had survived. This scene shows Troy's citadel viewed from the east, with the walls rising in terraces that follow the natural slope of the hill. The walls were built in a style unique to Troy, different from both Mycenaean and Hittite fortifications. The base was made of massive limestone segments, each several yards long, that met at shallow angles, creating a sawtooth pattern along the entire perimeter. This feature is also found in Mycenaean citadels, but at Troy it appears in other buildings as well, leading archaeologists to believe it was both functional and decorative. Above the stone base, a superstructure of timber and mud brick raised the total height beyond 30 feet. Rectangular towers, similar to Hittite designs, were positioned at strategic points along the circuit, offering an unobstructed view of the plain and the sea beyond. At the gates, the walls overlapped in an ingenious way, forcing any attacker to expose himself to fire from 2 sides at once. With no room to use a battering ram, a cistern was built inside one of the northeastern towers, ensuring water supply during prolonged sieges. Homer described this city as strong, well-built, and high-walled. The Greeks even claimed these walls had been raised by the gods Poseidon and Apollo, so imposing were they. What archaeologists have uncovered confirms that the poetic description had a basis in reality. Inside the walls, the citadel was organized in concentric terraces rising toward the top of the hill. On the highest terrace, there was probably a royal palace, though most remains from that level were destroyed by construction projects from the classical period, centuries later. On the outermost terrace, Archaeologists found the remains of two-story houses that belonged to the Trojan elite. These houses were built with stone exteriors and lighter materials on the upper floors and had no ground floor windows, giving each residence the appearance of a small fortress. Some featured Megaron-style floor plans with a central hall and columns, similar to those found in Mycenaean cities like Tiryns and Pylos. The ground floor was used for storage, while the living quarters were upstairs. In the days of Troy 7a, however, the character of the citadel had changed dramatically. Numerous small houses were built within the walls, filling every available space, and the monumental buildings were subdivided into smaller, more cramped compartments to accommodate a population that had concentrated itself within the defenses. In nearly all of these houses, archaeologists found enormous storage jars called pithoi buried in the ground, with only their mouths above floor level. Some buildings contained more than 20 of these vessels, each standing nearly 6 feet tall. It was as though the entire city was stockpiling supplies, anticipating days of siege, or perhaps already living through one. Now we descend from the citadel and enter the lower town, which during the time of Troy 7a appears to have been even more extensive than in any previous period. Remains of a dense neighborhood were found just outside the citadel walls, and traces of Bronze Age occupation spread across a vast area to the south. There were stone threshing floors, workshops where bronze tools were forged and shaped, and clear signs of local industries. Large quantities of murex shells were found, indicating the production of purple dye, one of the most valuable commodities in the ancient world. Textile production was one of the city's most important activities. There is evidence that fabrics made in Troy were exported to distant regions, making it not just a maritime checkpoint, but also a manufacturing center with its own products. Horse bones appeared in significant numbers in the excavations, echoing Homer's famous description of the Trojans as tamers of horses. Prince Hector, Troy's greatest warrior in the Iliad, carries the epithet horse tamer, and it is possible that horse breeding was indeed part of Trojan prosperity. Sheep farming sustained the textile industry, and the fertile agricultural land surrounding the citadel fed an economy that combined herding, farming, and long-distance trade. Moving through the city, we reach the South Gate, which served as the main entrance to the citadel, the point where Troy's two worlds connected. A massive stone tower guarded the passage, and outside, stone stelae with decorative reliefs were found over the centuries, possibly depicting protective figures or deities watching over the entrance. One of these stelae, found outside the gate of Troy 1, is among the earliest known stone relief sculptures in Western Anatolia, showing an anthropomorphic figure with a weapon at its side. This tradition of placing stelae before the gates endured for centuries at Troy, surviving destructions and rebuildings, as though certain sacred practices outlasted the walls themselves. The South Gate connected the lower town to the citadel by a paved and drained roadway, and it was through there that the constant flow of people, goods, and animals that gave Troy its life passed daily. By the time of Troy 7a, the West Gate had been sealed shut, reducing access points and reinforcing the city's defensive posture. Troy's geographic position explains both its wealth and the conflicts it attracted over the centuries. The city sat at the southern entrance to the Dardanelles Strait, the maritime passage linking the Aegean Sea to the Sea of Marmara, and from there to the Black Sea. Any vessel making that crossing came within reach of Troy, and the city profited from that position through trade, tolls, and political influence. Hittite texts from the same era refer to a city called Wilusa, located in this region, protected by treaties and involved in the politics of the Hittite Empire. Most scholars now accept that Wilusa and Troy were the same city, placing it at the center of a web of alliances and rivalries that stretched across Anatolia and the Aegean world. Troy was not just a fortress on a hill. It was a regional capital, a point of convergence between cultures, a place where Anatolia met the Aegean and where trade met power. Imagine arriving at this coast by sea after weeks of sailing across the Aegean and catching sight of Troy's hill for the first time, its walls gleaming in the sunlight. For sailors coming from Mycenaean Greece, this must have been a sight that combined admiration with tension. Mycenaean pottery was found at Troy, though in surprisingly small quantities, less than 1% of the total, suggesting commercial contact between the two cultures, but not a dominant Greek presence. The relationship between Greeks and Trojans was complex, made of exchanges and rivalries, cultural proximity and political distance. The epic tradition turned that tension into the greatest conflict in Greek mythology, but what archaeology reveals is more subtle. Two civilizations that knew each other, that traded with one another, and that eventually collided. Now, I want to bring this city to the specific moment that concerns us, to what tradition describes as the last night before the fall of Troy. According to accounts preserved in Virgil's Aeneid and fragments of other poems from the epic cycle, the Greeks had broken camp and apparently sailed away, leaving behind only an enormous wooden structure in the shape of a horse. The Greek fleet had sailed behind the nearby island of Tenedos, out of sight. On the plain before the walls, where for an entire decade there had been tents, campfires, and the constant noise of an army in position, there was now only silence and that monumental object standing before the gates. The Trojans went out to examine the abandoned ground, stepping for the first time in 10 years onto soil that had been enemy territory. Inside the city, opinion was divided. Some wanted to destroy the horse or cast it into the sea. Others wanted to bring it inside the walls as a trophy, as definitive proof that the war was over. A priest named Laocoon came running down from the citadel, shouting that it was madness to trust any gift left by the Greeks. He hurled his spear at the side of the horse, and its hollow interior echoed with a groan that should have been warning enough. But a Greek soldier named Sinon, who had stayed behind pretending to be a deserter, told a convincing story. He said the horse was a sacred offering to the goddess Athena, and that the Greeks had deliberately built it too large to fit through the gates. Precisely so, the Trojans couldn't bring it inside and receive the goddess's protection. Destroying the horse would bring Athena's fury upon Troy. Bringing it inside would make the city invincible. The prophetess Cassandra tried to warn of the approaching danger, but by an ancient curse, her true words were never believed. When sea serpents rose from the water and killed Laocoon and his sons, the Trojans interpreted the event as divine punishment against the man who had dared strike the offering, and the decision was made. If we look at this moment as the portrait of a city exhausted by 10 years of siege, the choice becomes less absurd. It wasn't simply naivety, it was the accumulated weight of a decade of suffering, pushing an entire people toward the answer they most wanted to hear. The horse was dragged inside the walls with ropes made of flax. That night Troy celebrated as it hadn't in years. The temples were adorned with festive boughs, voices filled the narrow streets of the citadel, and for a few hours the entire city surrendered to the belief that peace had finally arrived. Virgil describes how after the celebrations the city fell asleep, with the sentries relaxed and the gates left unguarded. Night rose from the sea and wrapped in its vast shadow the earth, the sky, and the deception hidden inside the wooden structure. Throughout the city, the Trojans slept in silence, slumber lapping their bodies tired from war and from celebration. While the city slept, the Greek fleet returned silently from Tenedos under the favorable light of the moon. The ships glided quietly onto the beach. Sinon opened the horse, and the warriors hidden inside climbed down on ropes to the ground. They made for the city gates and opened them for the army already approaching. What followed, according to Virgil, was total devastation. Fire in the streets, Hand-to-hand combat between the cramped houses, screams echoing against walls that no longer protected anyone. The royal palace was breached, the old King Priam killed before the altar where he had sought refuge. Aeneas, the Trojan prince who survived that night, described how he was woken by the ghost of Hector appearing in a dream to warn him that the city was lost and that he must flee with the sacred objects and the household gods. When he stepped outside, he found Troy already in flames, the streets lit not by mourning but by the fire consuming everything. The archaeological layer corresponding to Troy 7a confirms elements of this account. Intense burn marks, layers of violent destruction, and human bone fragments found in houses and streets, all consistent with a city that was captured, looted, and burned by enemies. Knowing what we know now, it's strange to think how that night of celebration must have felt completely normal, completely deserved to the people who lived there. Families gathered after years of tension, children running through the streets without fear for the first time they could remember. The sound of music where before there had been only the sound of watchfulness. And yet, at that very moment, destruction was already inside the gates, waiting for the city to fall asleep. The story of Troy became, over more than 3,000 years, one of the most enduring accounts of the fragility of security and the danger of believing something simply because it is what you most want to be true. As for the wooden horse itself, scholars have debated for centuries what it truly represented. Some propose it was a metaphor for a siege engine, such as a battering ram covered with damp horsehides to protect it from fire, a documented practice in ancient warfare. Others suggest it was a reference to merchant ships of the hippos type, Phoenician vessels decorated with horse heads, and that Greek warriors may have hidden inside the hull of such a ship, possibly disguised as tribute. A more speculative theory links the horse to Poseidon, god of both horses and earthquakes, and proposes that a seismic event damaged the walls and allowed the Greeks' entry. This theory is supported by the fact that Troy 6 was indeed destroyed by an earthquake before being rebuilt as 7a, and that the region is geologically unstable. Whatever the case, the ancient details about the horse are surprisingly concrete. We know the name of the craftsman who built it, Epius, and that the timber came from Mount Ida. We know it had wheels, that it was moved with flaxen ropes, and that it could be opened from the side. These details suggest that even if the literal horse is a poetic elaboration, the memory of a real stratagem may lie behind the story. After the destruction of Troy 7a, around 1180 before Christ, the survivors rebuilt the city on the same ruins in a phase known as Troy 7b. The old walls were reused once again, and the material culture showed continuity with the previous period. But new elements also appeared, including a type of handmade pottery that some archaeologists associate with populations from Central Europe. A remarkable find was a bronze seal inscribed in hieroglyphic Luwian, bearing the names of a woman and a man who was a scribe, the only example of pre-classical writing found at the entire site of Troy. The population declined, foreign imports nearly vanished, and rebuilding was confined to the citadel. The city never recovered its former importance. It was destroyed one final time around 950 before Christ and remained largely abandoned for centuries, until Greek colonists founded a new city there called Ilion, which the Romans would later know as Ilium, and which received public buildings from Emperor Augustus, who traced his ancestry back to the Trojan prince Aeneas. Now, I want to bring you into the present and show how these places look today. Thanks for being here, and if you have thoughts or suggestions for future cities, share them in the comments. Let's get into it. The hill of Hisarlik sits roughly 3 miles from the Aegean coast in northwestern Turkey, near the modern city of Çanakkale. The mound rises more than 50 feet above the farmland surrounding it, and the archaeological site was added to the UNESCO World Heritage List in 1998. The limestone walls of Troy 6 are still visible, tracing the contour of the hill, though without the timber and mud brick superstructure that once raised them to far greater heights. Wooden boardwalks and gravel paths guide visitors through a circuit that takes roughly 1 to 2 hours to complete. The East Gate can still be visited, and its 2 overlapping wall lines remain an impressive example of Bronze Age defensive engineering. The Eastern Tower, added in a later phase, still stands as a silent witness to the skill of the Trojan builders who worked there more than 3,000 years ago. From the top of the walls, on clear days, you can still make out the waters of the Dardanelles to the north, exactly as Trojan sentries would have seen them. Inside the citadel, the spaces where the cramped houses of Troy 7A once stood are now excavated areas with exposed stone foundations. The great storage jars have been removed to museums, but the holes where they were once buried are still recognizable in the ground. A permanent canopy shelters the remains of a megaron and sections of older walls, allowing visitors to see the layers of occupation stacked one upon another, like pages of a book compressed by the weight of centuries. The Troy Museum, opened in 2018 in the village of Tevfikiye, sits about half a mile from the site. The cube-shaped building, with extensive underground galleries, houses more than 40,000 artifacts, of which some 2,000 are on permanent display. At the entrance to the ruins, a wooden replica of the Trojan horse greets visitors, who can climb inside and look out from its upper level. It has nothing authentic about it, but it serves to connect whoever arrives there with the story that brought them to this place. From the top of the walls, looking north, the landscape opens toward the Dardanelles. On clear days, you can make out the island the ancients called Tenedos, from which the Greek fleet is said to have returned on that final night. The Trojan plain stretches out in silence, covered in farmland and crossed by modern roads with no visible sign of what happened there more than 3,000 years ago. And yet, beneath that quiet earth, lie the ashes of a city that celebrated its last night of peace without knowing that war was already inside its gates. I do really appreciate you watching. Your ideas, input, and constructive feedback really do shape what comes next. Feel free to leave a comment below. Until next time.